Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of Florida History's February Virtual History at High Noon, exploring Florida's early civil rights movement. My name is Thomas Robinson. I am the Financial and Development Director here at the museum. I am a native Floridian. I have a bachelor's in history and a master's in library and information studies from Florida State. I have a master's in history from James Madison University, and I completed my PhD at the University of Mississippi in December of 2018, not long after I started working here. I want to take a moment to thank my colleagues here at the museum for inviting me to speak today. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to watch this. And I also want to take a second to thank my friends and family who shared the invite for this event on social media, and also a special thanks to my wife who gave me lots of tips on presenting in public. So without further ado, we'll get started. When one thinks of the civil rights movement, one often thinks of the 1950s and 1960s, of leaders such as Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and John Lewis, of historic events such as the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, or Freedom Summer, of groups such as SNCC, CORE, and the SCLC. However, people tend to forget, or it's not emphasized enough in the literature on the civil rights movement, that a vibrant resistance to Jim Crow and segregation existed in the time period so often, before the time period so often documented and discussed. In fact, one could make the argument that the resistance of the interwar period inspired and informed the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. On the home front during the war, and spurred by returning African-American veterans once the war ended, World War I inspired many to become active in the struggle to end Jim Crow. In Florida, women played enormous roles in mobilizing African-American communities to support the Allied war effort. This was part of a national effort by African-Americans to win a just peace at home by supporting a war for democracy abroad. As W.E.B. Du Bois argued, African Americans should support the war effort so that once the war is over, they could marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. Black Floridians stressed their contributions to the country past and present and voiced an expectation that segregation would share the same demise as the Germans. African Americans were aware of the irony of fighting for democracy abroad while living under tyranny at home, and made certain to bring this contradiction to the nation's attention. Leaders in Florida made it clear that loyalty to the American cause came with a condition. The state's treatment of its Black citizens had to change. African Americans made up about 30% of the state's population when World War I began, but provided over half the state's soldiers during the war. In return for this service and sacrifice, it was expected that all Black citizens of the state, not just the soldiers, would reap benefits. J.D. Avant, an organizer for the Victory Boys Division of Florida, called for support of the war effort in order to take advantage of an opportunity to show that African Americans were valued citizens. The Colored Knights of Pythias, a fraternal organization founded in 1864, argued lodge members should contribute to the war effort so that all men could be made equal citizens. African American women spearheaded Liberty Loan drives and played a central role in the framing of the meaning of Black service to the country. African Americans were urged to contribute to the loans in order for their race to receive credit for their share of support. Mary McLeod Bethune was a key leader in the loan drives. Bethune used the loan drives and meetings to choreograph a vision of expansive citizenship where men, women, and even children had their role to play. Similarly to Bethune, Eartha M.M. White was a leader of the State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, a teacher, and a community activist who coordinated the Black war effort in Florida as the chair of the Colored Women's Council of Defense. White toured the state in 1918 to solicit funds for the war effort from African American communities and used her tour to emphasize the need for equal rights. As a pioneer NAACP member, White used the war effort to advocate for just treatment for African Americans and asked for Black men to qualify for voting. By the summer of 1918, the Liberty Loan drives led by African Americans were a rousing success, and civil rights advocates hoped to use that to their advantage. James Weldon Johnson remembered a meeting held in Jacksonville in which Speaker J.H. Blodgett, a successful Jacksonville businessman, argued that what African Americans wanted to hear now was how the country intended to reward them for their loyalty. Blodgett further argued that if lynching, segregation, and political inequalities were not rectified, more and more Black Floridians would flee the state. African American women seized the moment to fight for better pay and improved working conditions throughout the state. African American railroad workers joined national unions and appealed directly to the federal government to demand intervention in the workplace. Florida's governor, at the time, Sidney Katz, stated very plainly that he thought African Americans were demanding nothing short of equality. Katz could not have been more correct. When World War I ended and troops began to come home, the fruits of victory were expected to lead to equal citizenship. During the first ceremonies after the armistice was signed, Black Floridians began organizing a new voter registration campaign. During Emancipation Day ceremonies in 1919, Reverend S.G. Baker of Daytona argued that African American soldiers were instrumental in bringing about worldwide peace and made the world safe for democracy. As such, Baker urged Black men to become registered voters. At an AME conference in West Palm Beach, Reverend R.C. Ransom bluntly asserted that the boys from overseas had been fighting for democracy abroad. They would expect the same brand of democracy at home: freedom of thought, equal opportunity, and an open door for every man. If democracy means anything, it means just this. Just as after the Civil War there had been a Reconstruction, many African American leaders expected the end of World War I to bring about another Reconstruction of the country. Mary McLeod Bethune emphasized that men and women had shouldered the burdens of citizenship during the war, and she argued there was a link between the end of the Civil War and the end of World War I. By the end of both wars, African Americans had proven their loyalty to America. This linkage to the past bolstered contemporary claims for equal citizenship. At a memorial conference in Key West, Reverend D.W. Demps explicitly linked to the past, stating that the Black man had played a noble part in winning the Civil War and the Great War, and now African Americans should enjoy the rights, principles, and freedom of the country. When Jacksonville held a large welcome home parade on May 1st, 1919, organizers of the parade were conscious to use it as a tool to promote social change. The event publicly and explicitly promoted the idea that Black Floridians had made enormous contributions to the nation, and they were no longer willing to endure the tyranny of Jim Crow. Dr. J.A. Gregg, the president of Edward Waters College and a delegate to the statewide civil rights organization, the Negro Uplift Association, delivered the keynote address at the parade. Historian Paul Ortiz has described Gregg's address as a declaration of war on Jim Crow and a call for a major offensive against segregation. Many returning soldiers drove this offensive. Henry Thomas, an infantry veteran, returned to Gadsden County and started a chapter of the NAACP in Greensboro. This chapter would soon help spearhead a voter registration drive in the county, the first of its kind, I would add. L.A. Alexander, an artilleryman who rose to the rank of corporal, returned to West Palm Beach, hoping and expecting to reap the benefits of fighting for democracy abroad. The League for Democracy, a Black veterans organization, was founded in Jacksonville. The group set goals of ending Jim Crow laws, ending lynching, disfranchisement, discrimination, inequality in education, sought economic freedom and justice in the legal system. Anytime in history there is a revolution, there is always a counter-revolution. During Reconstruction, white Southerners ultimately responded with violence and redeemed the South politically. In the aftermath of World War I, white Floridians were determined to return to the racial status quo by attempting to control labor and the movement of African Americans. African American workers in the state launched a series of post-war organizing drives and strikes that bolstered the rising expectations of social and economic justice. From farm laborers to domestic workers to forest workers, African American men and women battled to raise their wages as high as possible. At the beginning of the Great Migration, Black Floridians fled the state looking for better living and working conditions in the North, Midwest, and West. By the end of World War I, African Americans in the state were struggling to change the repressive conditions in Florida. This created a groundswell of activism, with African American leaders calling for activity geared toward petitioning the federal government for intervention, unionizing efforts, strikes, and trying to vote. Out of this momentum came the organizing of the Negro Uplift Association, which sought to end lynching and remove political discrimination, wanted fairer economic conditions, and equal funding for education. Across the state, NUA branches sprung up. A writer for an African American newspaper in St. Lucie County argued that Black Floridians should support the NUA's goals if they want better opportunities and better citizenship. Now, it's important to note many of the NUA leaders, one of which I mentioned earlier, Dr. J.A. Gregg, were also members of the NAACP and other activist organizations, and they were vocal advocates for civil rights. An NUA committee formally presented a memorial to the state legislature in May 1919, asking the state to end lynching and Jim Crow laws. State legislators were so enraged by the petition that it was purged from the Senate record. But the failure of the petition was a watershed moment for Black political organizers. Mary McLeod Bethune stated that the failure was a sign that this was a new era of Reconstruction, and concepts such as citizenship, democracy, and economic security had to be redefined and fought for. It was also a stark reminder that African Americans were not going to be rewarded for their effort during the Great War. The 1920 presidential election gave African Americans the chance to try to break down one-party rule in the South. In early 1919, calls were already being made to start a voter registration movement throughout the state. Those calls only became louder after the NUA's petition was stricken from the record. And thanks to the passage of the 19th Amendment, Black women would play a decisive role in the movement. One woman stated that she advocated for the right to vote because she needed to let the Southern white man know that the Civil War had made Black people free, they were no longer slaves, and they have the right to be protected by our laws. The past history of promoting mutual aid, Black women created a shared language of political struggle and utilized religious organizations and colored women's clubs to spread the word about voting. In living rooms and churches, Black women promoted equal citizenship and voting rights. Similarly, the Knights of Pythias, a men's social organization, promoted voter registration among their members. This was of no small consequence, since approximately 1 out of every 6 African American men in the state were members of the Knights. From just the nights alone, approximately 15,000 Black men registered to vote in the lead up to the 1920 presidential election. Groups such as women's clubs and the Knights of Pythias had an effect of taking local voter registration campaigns and making them statewide. From New York, W.E.B. Du Bois noted the impact of these groups, writing in his newspaper, The Crisis, that there was a heavy registration of Negro voters, which has already had a telling effect on the struggle to vote in Florida. All throughout the state, public forums cropped up, where African-American men and women expressed their thoughts on politics. These public forums came about due to the organizing of groups such as the Central Republic Club, the NAACP, the Florida State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and the Negro Uplift Association. These forums were utilized to educate citizens about the 13th and 14th Amendments, about the intricacies of the poll tax and voter registration laws, and about political history. The forums also had the effect of democratizing the movement, allowing the working class to participate in the process of making the agenda for the movement. These public forums were not unlike the freedom schools that would be founded by SNCC in 1963. Once women became eligible to vote, the voter registration movement gained even more momentum. African-American women in Florida accounted for 40% of total women's voter registration in the state, and very much drove much of the political organizing done in the state. Women's clubs encouraged women to not only vote, but also to form Republican clubs in their towns and counties. African-American women formed Harding Coolidge clubs to promote voting for Republican candidate Warren G. Harding, who had made early statements promoting civil rights and women's suffrage. On the state level, leaders such as Mary McLeod Bethune organized a conference with representatives from the NAACP, the NUA, and the Miami Colored Board of Trade to build a coalition between male and female voters. The goal was to bring civil rights organizations together to promote a Republican victory that could bring a reconstruction of the South not seen since the end of the Civil War. Groups of women began showing up at registrars' offices to register to vote. Activists canvassed neighborhoods over and over and over again. In Jacksonville, over 2,000 Black women registered to vote in the very first week they were allowed. Election officials tried to harass, intimidate, and trick the women, but still they came in droves. And it was not just in Jacksonville where this happened. Reports indicated that scores of African-American women were registering to vote in Brevard County, Gainesville, Orlando, St. Augustine, Palatka, DeLand, Daytona, West Palm Beach, Pensacola. In rural areas such as Gadsden and Marion counties, often poor African Americans were encouraged to vote as a way to ensure that they could live as politically empowered citizens, not reliant on white bosses. In some areas, as many as 15 times as many African American women were registered to vote as compared to white women. As voter registration succeeded, the goals of the movement shifted to include transforming the Republican Party into a new party that would promote civil rights and would destroy white supremacy. By rousing the Republican Party, Black voters could not only attempt to help Harding win the presidency, they could focus on local races, such as sheriff and judgeships. The movement was so successful that the NAACP used Florida as a model for what could be done to end disfranchisement in the South. As I said before, though, anytime there's a revolution, there's a counter-revolution, and this success drew the ire of many white Floridians. The Ku Klux Klan reorganized in the state in the summer of 1920 as a direct response to the success of Black organizers. Not surprisingly, new Klan chapters popped up in counties where African Americans were registering to vote in the largest numbers. And it was not just paramilitary groups that attempted to intimidate Black voters. State and local Democratic officials engaged in intimidation, threatening to arrest any African American women who tried to register to vote. And newspapers throughout the state also printed many stories about women being arrested trying to register to vote to further try to scare African American women. Names were purged from the voter registration list. Election commissioners purposefully planned to have a shortage of election inspectors at Black polling places so as to turn away voters. All of these tactics began in the summer of 1920, but only expanded as Election Day got closer. In October, officials in Gadsden County, a hotbed of NAACP meetings, banned public gatherings of African Americans. The KKK threatened to kill any activist leaders in the county, and one editor wrote that several prominent Black leaders were forced to flee the county seat of Quincy under threat of death for urging African Americans to qualify, register, and vote. Klan members did, in fact, murder several Knights of Pythias members in the county and destroyed lodges in several communities in the county. The same cycle of violence played out in other Florida communities as well. The Klan threatened and beat leaders in Fort Myers, Sanford, Columbia County, Live Oak, Orlando. In Daytona, Klan members surrounded the campus dorms of Mary McLeod Bethune School for Young Ladies. Rather than being intimidated, the students sang and the Klan retreated. The retreat by the Klan seemed to be the exception, not the rule. On Election Day, a Black man named Dan Thomas was shot and killed in Palmetto while leading a group up the steps of the county courthouse. Armed groups of white men terrorized potential voters in Miami and Jacksonville and in rural counties like Gadsden and Liberty. The most infamous example of violence related to the election of 1920 occurred in Ocoee. Despite being warned not to attempt to vote, African Americans in Ocoee still turned out on Election Day. A mob of white men from the town and surrounding communities as far away as Orlando destroyed parts of the African American section of the town, wantonly beating and killing men, women, and children. Rather than being horrified, the massacre lifted the spirits of some white Floridians. United Confederate veterans changed the timing of their convention in Orlando so they could visit Ocoee and see the carnage for themselves. In the end, at least 56 African Americans were killed and over 500 were driven from the town. The NAACP estimated that another 30 to 60 African Americans were killed on Election Day. In the weeks after the election, the violence continued. Despite that, the generation of 1917, as historian Colin Palmer has called them, did not shrink away from demanding justice. African Americans continued to protest and strive for justice in a vigorous, sustained, multifaceted way. In some communities, voting and open political organizing did ground to a halt. In other areas, though, activists continued to try to get the vote out. In Pensacola, local leaders reorganized their NAACP chapter after the election of 1920, and the chapter continued to grow throughout the decade. In Gadsden County, J.T. Smith was blunt and stated that the violence in 1920 had forced him underground. Yet he continued to recruit new members in the county throughout the 1920s and 1930s. And Smith and his organization would re-emerge in the 1950s and 1960s in large numbers. African American women continued to promote civil rights in the aftermath of the 1920 election. Blanche Armwood spent the decade advocating against lynching and promoting equal opportunities in education. Eartha White continued to work with the City Federation of Women's Clubs to promote charitable activities. and founded a mission to meet the needs of the poor during the Great Depression. As part of this mission, Ms. White created a community center that discussed voting, promoted education, and other civil rights ventures. White was also a founding member of the Florida Anti-Lynching Crusaders Committee and spent the decade denouncing lynching, as well as advocating for prison reform. Mary McLeod Bethune served as the vice president and then president of the National Association of Colored Women from 1922 to 1928. In this role, Bethune gave speeches not only in just Florida, but throughout the country, promoting education and the power of women to make a positive impact in their communities. As president of the NACW, Bethune thought the organization could be used to promote the advancement of Black women throughout the entire world. Bethune also stayed active with the NAACP, working hard to get that organization to include Black women in leadership roles in the fight against racism. In this way, Bethune was representative of a growing group of Black women activists who traveled widely to give speeches during the 1920s. Blanche Armwood traveled around the country during elections to encourage African Americans to vote. Despite the threats of violence and lynching that African Americans faced during the time period, Black women were developing strong ties that offered mutual support across regional boundaries. Bethune and leaders like her emphasized that Black women face the same types of problems nationwide, and the only way to end sexism and racial discrimination was to tackle it on a national scale. These activists believed that African American women could still be a force in national politics despite the blowback that occurred in 1920. Bethune argued that political and social emancipation were tied to civic and political matters, and the only way Black people could be emancipated from injustice and inequality was by playing a part in local government and voting. Bethune also represented a change in thought that has often been attributed to the generation of 1917. That is, by the mid-1920s, Bethune was focused on systemic change to improve conditions for African Americans. Prior to this time period, many civil rights organizers focused on changing individual behavior. Now, leaders such as Bethune argued that the national government needed to remove barriers for racial equality. The focus had to be on forcing the United States to live up to its democratic ideals by having a political voice and becoming more involved in legislative issues. In other words, Bethune and activists like her were arguing that voting was not enough. Instead, African Americans needed to focus on the humanitarian, moral, social, and economic problems that were occurring in the country and throughout the world. As such, Bethune began to discuss colonialism and creating a link between people of color worldwide. Bethune also believed that African Americans should be aware of political issues that dealt with things beyond racial discrimination, such as child labor, militarism, and education, something that leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. would echo in the 1960s. As lawyer and housing reformer Clara Burrell Bruce put it, Black women had for too long been thinking about individual problems instead of national ones. By the end of the 1920s, Bruce argued that Black women's groups were well informed on international problems and national affairs and could use that knowledge to advocate for Black women's political concerns, as well as to expand the role women played in the formal political sphere as leaders. In an odd way, the Great Depression and the subsequent New Deal gave African American leaders a chance to both access political power and to redevelop a Black political power base that had been somewhat lost after the 1920 election. While the New Deal certainly had limitations in terms of how much it did for African Americans, at the time, the Roosevelt administration was viewed as an opportunity to achieve economic, political, and social equality. This was partially because Roosevelt appointed a number of men as agency heads who were openly committed to civil rights, and some had even worked with interracial organizations in the South promoting equality. While reformers such as Bethune, who later served as an advisor to Roosevelt, acknowledged there were shortcomings to the New Deal, they also pointed out that African Americans were making gains in housing and education thanks to programs enacted by the Roosevelt administration. Still, the reality is that most New Deal programs did not have a tangible effect on African Americans, and if they did at all, it was not until the mid-1930s. The importance of the New Deal, though, to the African American freedom struggle was twofold. First, as historian Joyce Hanson has argued, there was a psychological benefit to African American communities as they saw the federal government hiring African Americans for important positions. Roosevelt appointed Black leaders to important posts, while federal agencies hired African Americans as architects, lawyers, statisticians, economists, engineers, stenographers, secretaries, messengers, and clerks. While Roosevelt's administration did not provide a turning point for race relations in the country, the psychological effect that Hanson speaks of is one that was centered around increased opportunities. Although state segregation laws were not struck down or even challenged, the increased opportunities were viewed as a significant first step to integration. James Weldon Johnson made just such an argument in 1934, stating that common sense compels us to get whatever and all the good we can out of the system of imposed segregation. The second importance of the New Deal was it started to shift the voting allegiance of African Americans. The vast majority of African Americans voted Republican in the years after the Civil War. After all, the Republicans were the party of Lincoln and emancipation. Yet, with the failure of Republican presidents to tackle increasingly hard economic times for African Americans in the mid to late 20s, African American support of the Republican Party was undermined. Increasingly, Black political activists abandoned the party. This included Floridians such as Bethune and Johnson, who publicly supported Democrats for national office from the early 1930s onward. Within 4 years of Roosevelt's election in 1932, a political realignment among African Americans was well underway. On the state level, activists began to emerge publicly again during the Roosevelt administration. So in some ways, that could perhaps be a third importance of the New Deal. This is probably best personified by Harry T. Moore, who founded the Brevard County chapter of the NAACP with his wife Harriet in 1934. Harry was born in Suwannee County and had lived in Daytona Beach and Jacksonville before attending Florida Memorial College's high school program. After graduating, Harry taught 4th grade in Cocoa, where he met Harriet, who was selling insurance for the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, a major Black-owned business. Both the Moores completed college degrees at Bethune-Cookman College and moved to Titusville, where Harry was the principal of the Titusville Colored School and Harriet taught. At the school, Harry taught students about Black history, current events, and politics. He lectured on the New Deal. He also taught the students about voting. As early as 1933, Harry was bringing sample ballots to his 9th graders so they could learn about voting and about candidates. When the Moores organized the Brevard NAACP chapter in 1934, at first they focused on social and educational activities. Over time, they built up a network of ministers, teachers, and Black citrus grove owners to promote the organization. Harry Moore used his role as an activist to push for a statewide NAACP organization, publicly called for African Americans to join the NAACP, worked on issues of housing and education, and investigated cases of lynching. As part of the Florida State Teachers Association, a union of African American teachers, Moore sued to gain equal pay for Black public school teachers, a case that was promoted by the NAACP and drew the attention of Thurgood Marshall. Although Moore is well known for his civil rights work during World War II and into the late 1940s and early 1950s, throughout the 1930s, Moore and his wife represented the civil rights leaders who were willing to use Roosevelt's presidency as an opening to once again publicly call for an end to Jim Crow laws. Moore was outspoken about white violence and pushed for African American voting. Specifically, Moore also represented the shift of African Americans to the Democratic Party, as Moore organized for African Americans to join the party and challenge the all-white primary that existed in Florida and other states. Many of these initiatives spilled into the 1940s, but the genesis of them began with Moore's work in the 30s. The events of the 1950s and 1960s are much more famous in terms of the history of the civil rights movement. Oftentimes, when people think of the period between World War I and World War II, they think about Ocoee, Rosewood, lynchings, and violence. Those events, although important to remember, did not stymie attempts of African American leaders to fight for justice regarding a host of issues. The generation of 1917 laid the groundwork for future successes in the 1950s and 1960s, and even had some successes of their own. In closing, I want to tell the story of A. Philip Randolph, because I think Randolph speaks to this. Asa Philip Randolph was born in Crescent City and spent his youth in Jacksonville, leaving for New York City in 1911 at the age of 22. While attending the Cookman Institute as a high school student, Randolph read works by authors such as W.E.B. Du Bois and decided that fighting for social equality was important. Randolph soon became an organizer, forming unions as early as 1917. Most famously, Randolph helped found the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925. This was the first predominantly African-American union. The fortunes of the union were faltering until Roosevelt became president. Within 2 years of Roosevelt's election, amendments to the Railway Labor Act granted porters rights under federal law. Membership in the Brotherhood skyrocketed, and Randolph was able to gain concessions such as pay increases, a shorter work week, and overtime pay for the members of his union. Randolph would go on to become one of the most visible spokespeople for civil rights in the country after his success with the union. Randolph spoke out against discrimination in the military, in government agencies, and in unions. In 1941, Randolph and fellow activists Bayard Rustin and A.G. Musty proposed a march on Washington to protest racial discrimination in war industries, an end to segregation, access to defense employment, the proposal of an anti-lynching law, and the desegregation of the armed forces. Roosevelt responded by issuing the Fair Employment Act, an early civil rights victory that ended discrimination in the war industries. Lifted by these successes, Randolph continued to press for the rights of African Americans for the rest of his life, perhaps culminating with the famous March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28, 1963. And though Randolph never lived in Florida again, he remembered the lessons he learned in his home state, which prompted him to believe that color was less important than a person's character and conduct, and to always be willing to defend what you believe in. Thank you. So at this time, if you have any questions, I would be happy to take them. Just log them in the chat box. I can see the chat box, so if you post questions there, I will do my best to answer them. Anyone? Questions? Did I scare you all away? Well, as you're thinking of questions, I would be derelict in my duty for my job here at the museum. If you enjoy presentations like this, programs like this, please do consider becoming a member of the museum, and that would be great. Okay, I'm seeing, why do I think so much of the 1917 generation is not well known? I think it's mostly with a lot of things in history, cards on the table. My background is sort of studying the Civil War, and I think there's kind of a correlation here between the way the Civil War is remembered and the Civil Rights Movement, and that a lot of times public knowledge of the Civil Rights Movement is based on movies, popular culture, and then also just a lot of the leaders of the Civil Rights Movement who tend to be remembered are people like Martin Luther King, who did a lot of their work in the 50s and 60s. So I think a lot of times what's emphasized are the victories of that time period and the leaders of that time period, and not so much maybe the groundwork that was laid in earlier decades. Although there is, in academia, there is something known as the long Civil Rights Movement, where there are historians who write kind of all the way from, you know, the 1870s, 1880s, all the way up to the 1950s and 60s. The question about, do I have a favorite book on the material I talked about today? Yeah, I do have one that I would recommend. I'm blanking on the title off the top of my head, but the author is Paul Ortiz, and he writes about African-American organizing in the state from really the post-Civil War period up till the end of World War I. He's got a lot of really great information about kind of the World War I, post-World War I period, but the whole book is really interesting. There's also a really good book about Mary McLeod Bethune and women's activism that I would suggest as well, but I can't remember I think that might be Joyce Hanson's book. Let me see. Why don't I think Roosevelt tackled segregation laws? He didn't want to lose Southern Democrats, simple as that. He was afraid to lose his voting power in the South, and at that, you know, Roosevelt was a Democrat, and he didn't want to lose that base. How do I think Florida measures up now? I don't know if I'm qualified to speak to that necessarily. I don't think, yeah, I don't know if I can speak to that. I'm not a political scientist, so it's not my area of expertise. The Negro Uplift Association continued their work into the 30s and 40s. Yes, Emancipation Betrayed by Paul Ortiz, thank you. The Negro Uplift Association continued their work, but I don't know off the top of my head when they disbanded or anything like that. I don't have a specific recommendation about the early NAACP. I'm sorry. Take this on the road. I don't know how well children would respond to me, but I could certainly try. I'll talk to the education folks here. They're much better at dealing with children than I am. My wheelhouse is more adults. All right, well, I thank you all for joining me today. This was our first go at doing this live, so I hope you enjoyed it. Please be on the lookout for other virtual events that the museum will be doing in the future on our Facebook page. And if you can't get enough of this, a recording of this will be posted on our social media as well. Take care, thank you.